All right, so let's dive right in to the world of French grammar.
Sounds good.
And today we're going to be talking about diminutives and augmentatives.
That's right.
And specifically for our listeners who are using Pronunciator's Library module to try to get a certificate in this topic.
Absolutely.
I think this is going to be a really valuable deep dive for them.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area of French grammar.
It is.
And it can really add a lot of nuance to your speaking and your writing.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that's worth taking the time to master.
So let's start with diminutives.
Okay.
And, we know that in general, diminutives, they make things smaller or cuter or a little less serious.
Right.
But I'm curious.
Yeah.
Are there times when adding a diminutive suffix can actually make the word sound worse?
Yeah. What's interesting about that is that you're absolutely right.
Okay.
Sometimes adding a diminutive suffix can actually make a word have a more negative connotation.
Go.
For example, let's take the word maigre, which means thin.
Right.
If you add the diminutive chaton to it, you get maigrechon.
Okay.
And now instead of simply describing someone as thin, it suggests that they're unhealthily thin.
Oh.
Almost gaunt.
I see.
So it's like the diminutive is adding this layer of judgment or criticism.
Right.
Rather than just making the size smaller.
Okay, so it's really about the context then.
Exactly. It's not enough to just know the suffixes. You need to understand how they're being used in different situations to really grasp their meaning.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to augmentatives then.
Sure.
Generally they make things bigger or bolder or more intense.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if there are any surprising ways that augmentatives can change the meaning of a word.
Absolutely.
Okay.
In a similar way to diminutives, augmentatives can sometimes take on a negative connotation as well.
Yep.
For example, the word riche means rich.
Right.
But if you add arde to it, you get richarde. And richarde can mean very rich, but it can also carry this connotation of someone who's ostentatious or maybe even a bit miserly with their wealth.
Oh, wow.
So again, it's all about context and understanding the nuances of how these suffixes are being used.
But just like with diminutives, the emotional weight of the word can shift.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think this is where things get really interesting for, someone like your listeners who are trying to develop a deeper understanding of French. Mastering these subtleties is really what separates a good French speaker from a truly fluent one.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Now, we've been talking a lot about nouns.
We have.
But can adjectives get in on the diminutive and augmentative action too?
You're thinking along the right lines.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can we make descriptions themselves bigger or smaller?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's definitely less common than with nouns,
right.
But it's totally possible.
Great.
So, for example, the word petit means small.
Right.
But if you add tout before it, you get tout petit. And now you're talking tiny, minuscule.
I like it.
You're really emphasizing that smallness.
Yeah.
Or you can take the word jolie, which means pretty.
Okay.
Add a recit, and you get ouillette, which means very pretty.
Oh, wow.
Exquisitely so.
So we can amplify.
Yes.
Or minimize the intensity of descriptions, just like we do with nouns.
Exactly.
It's really interesting how these linguistic tools can be used.
Yeah, they're very versatile.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that.
Yeah, and that versatility is exactly what makes them so valuable in French.
That's a good point.
But as with any powerful tool, there are nuances and potential pitfalls to watch out for.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to ask about that.
Yeah.
Are there any common misconceptions or traps that our listeners, as aspiring certificate holders, should be aware of?
Yeah, definitely one of the biggest misconceptions is assuming that any word with a diminutive-looking suffix is actually a diminutive.
Oh.
For example, the word cigarette. It might look like a smaller version of cigar, but it's actually a completely different word with its own meaning.
So looks can be deceiving.
Absolutely.
In the world of French grammar.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's why it's so important to understand the context and the individual word meanings.
Right.
And speaking of context, we can't forget that these diminutives and augmentatives aren't just grammatical features. They're deeply embedded in French culture.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
We should talk more about that.
They really are. And it's something that you won't necessarily pick up just from studying a textbook. It's like learning the secret handshake of French communication.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So tell me, how do these diminutives and augmentatives reflect French culture.
Sure.
In ways that might surprise someone learning the language.
Well, one example that comes to mind is the use of diminutives in expressions of endearment. So, you might hear someone refer to their significant other as their petite amie or petite amie.
Right.
Which literally translates to little friend, but it actually means girlfriend or boyfriend.
I see.
So the diminutive is adding the sense of affection and intimacy to the word.
So it's more than just a literal translation.
Exactly. And it goes beyond romantic relationships. You might hear someone talking about their car and refer to it as their voiturette, which literally means little car.
Yeah.
But it often implies that it's a small, practical, maybe even beloved car.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not always about cuteness.
Right.
It can also convey a sense of practicality.
Exactly.
Some of the familiarity.
Exactly. And here's another example that might surprise you. Even some borrowed words in French have adopted diminutives or augmentatives.
Interesting.
So for example, the word weekend obviously came from English, but in French you might hear someone refer to a weekendette. Which is a short weekend getaway. Oh. So they've taken this borrowed word and they've given it a uniquely French twist.
By adding the diminutive.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
So it's cool how the language can kind of adapt it.
Yeah, it's constantly evolving and adapting.
And taking on these new influences.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of what makes French so fascinating to study.
I agree.
You're constantly uncovering these layers of meaning and cultural influence.
And I think for someone like our listener who's working towards a certificate in this topic, recognizing these nuances is key.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it shows a deeper understanding of the language and its cultural context.
Right. It shows that you're not just, learning the rules from a textbook, but you're actually engaging with the language.
Right. And getting out there and using it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what the pronunciator certificate aims to assess.
Now, with all this talk about cultural subtleties and exceptions to the rules, I have to ask, are there any major pitfalls that our listeners should be aware of?
Absolutely.
Are there any common mistakes that non-native speakers tend to make with diminutives and augmentatives?
Yeah. I think the biggest pitfall is assuming that every word can take a diminutive or an augmentative form. It really depends on the word itself and how it's used in context.
You can't just slap a suffix on any word and call it a day.
Right. Unfortunately, not French. Like any language has its quirks. And there are no hard and fast rules about which words can be modified in this way and which ones can't.
I see.
So it's more about developing an ear for the language. And paying attention to how native speakers use these forms.
So it's about immersing yourself in the language?
Exactly.
And picking up on those subtle cues. Okay. But are there any specific examples that you can think of? Of words that often trip people up?
Yeah. So, for example, the word lunette might sound like a small loon, meaning moon, but it actually means eyeglasses.
Interesting.
Or the word camionnette. Seems like it would be a small camion, meaning truck. But it actually refers to a van. So those are just a couple of examples of words where the diminutive or the augmentative has a completely different meaning from what you might expect.
Yeah, those are some tricky ones.
They are, yeah.
I can see how those could lead to some embarrassing situations.
Definitely.
So what advice would you give to our listener on how to avoid these traps? And really, nail those diminutive and augmentative distinctions?
Well, the best advice I can give is just to immerse yourself in the language as much as possible. Listen to how native French speakers are using these forms in everyday conversations. In songs and movies. Even reading French books and articles can be really helpful just to develop a natural feel for when a diminutive or augmentative is appropriate.
That's a great point. It's not just about memorizing rules. It's about developing an intuition for the language.
Exactly.
And that's, I think, what the Pronunciator app really tries to do.
Yes.
Through its interactive exercises and real-world examples.
Absolutely. Yeah, the more you expose yourself to authentic French, the more those subtle distinctions will start to make sense.
Yeah.
And, don't Don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way.
Right.
Even native speakers make mistakes.
They do.
Yeah.
That's encouraging.
Yeah.
So it's really about embracing the process and just kind of having fun with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think once you start mastering these diminutives and augmentatives, your French is going to sound so much more natural and expressive.
Right. You'll be able to add those little touches of humor and affection. And
yes, personality.
It's like adding a sprinkle of French je ne sais quoi to your conversations.
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive,
sure,
let's take a moment to recap some of the key takeaways for our listener.
Okay.
You know, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We started by exploring the common suffixes that are used to create diminutives and augmentatives.
Right, like ette and add and erard.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But we quickly moved beyond the mechanics to discover how these seemingly small changes can dramatically impact the meaning and the emotional weight of a word.
Exactly.
And we also learned that context is everything.
Yes.
The same suffix can have different effects, depending on the word that it's attached to.
Exactly.
And sometimes a word that looks like a diminutive might not be a diminutive at all.
Exactly.
Remember cigarette?
Yes. A perfect example.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
Yeah, of why it's so important to understand the individual word meanings and not just rely on the patterns.
Right.
And of course, we can't forget about the cultural significance of these forms. You know, they're not just grammatical quirks. They're woven into the fabric of French culture, reflecting nuances of affection and humor and social dynamics.
It's fascinating.
It is.
So for our listener who is on the path to earning that certificate in this topic, this deep dive has hopefully given you a richer, more nuanced understanding of how diminutives and augmentatives work in French.
Absolutely.
So as you continue your studies with Pronunciator, keep exploring those real-world examples.
Yes.
Pay attention to how native speakers use these forms.
Absolutely.
In different situations. And mastering this aspect of French grammar will really add a whole new level of depth and authenticity to your communication.
Absolutely.
It's like unlocking a secret code.
Yes.
To truly expressive French.
I love that.
Okay, so before we let you go.
We want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Okay.
You know, we've been talking about diminutives and augmentatives in French.
We have.
But this concept of adding suffixes to change a word's meaning isn't unique to French, is it?
That's a great point.
So as you continue your French journey, think about English.
Yes.
Can you identify similar patterns in our own language?
Right.
Do we have our own versions of diminutives and augmentatives?
Exactly.
Even if we don't call them that.
That's a great question to think about.
It's going to make me look at English words in a whole new light.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, we will let you go.
Sounds good.
Keep those ears open. Keep practicing. And don't be afraid to experiment.
Yes.
Most importantly, have fun with it.
Absolutely.
Until next time, happy learning.